In 1963, a man in central Turkey was renovating his house when he knocked through a section of wall in his basement and found, on the other side, a narrow stone passage that shouldn't have been there. He had no idea, in that moment, that he had just put his hand through the roof of a city, not a cave system, not a cellar. An actual city, carved entirely underground with streets, ventilation shafts, wells, chapels, stables, wine presses, and room after room stretching downward through 18 separate levels, deep enough into the earth to comfortably shelter, according to later estimates, up to 20,000 people at once, along with their livestock and food stores, for months at a time if it had to. It had been sitting there, completely sealed, completely forgotten, for who knows how many centuries, right underneath a small, unremarkable village that nobody suspected was built directly on top of one of the largest underground cities ever discovered on the planet. And here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. That city, now known as Derinkuyu, isn't unique. It isn't even alone. It's connected, or very possibly connected, to a network of other underground cities spread out beneath the same region, some of them still unexcavated, some of them deliberately sealed off and closed to the public today, and some of them, based on satellite surveys and ground-penetrating radar, still completely undiscovered, sitting silently beneath farmland that ordinary people are walking across every single day without the faintest idea of what's underneath their feet. Derinkuyu sits in the Cappadocia region of central Turkey, an area defined by strange cone-shaped rock formations carved out of soft volcanic stone called tuff, stone that's remarkably easy to carve when it's first exposed to air but hardens significantly over time, which turns out to be exactly the property that made this entire underground civilization possible in the first place. Once archaeologists began properly excavating and mapping Derinkuyu, the sheer scale of what they were dealing with became almost impossible to overstate. The city descends roughly 280 feet below the surface, organized into distinct functional levels the way a modern high-rise might be organized into floors, except this high-rise runs downward into solid rock instead of upward into the sky. The uppermost levels house stables for livestock and simple living quarters. Deeper down, excavators found wine and oil presses, kitchens with soot-blackened ceilings still visible today, storage rooms for food, and what appears to have been a religious school with a barrel-vaulted ceiling, along with a room believed to have functioned as a chapel, complete with a cruciform layout carved directly into the rock. Even deeper still, the city included a large open room believed to have served as a meeting hall or assembly space, and at its lowest levels, a series of rooms archaeologists initially identified as a dungeon, though later interpretation suggests they may simply have been additional storage or the deepest, most protected living quarters, reserved for moments of the most serious danger. And danger appears to be exactly why this place exists. Cut into the passageways at multiple points throughout the city are massive circular stone doors, some weighing close to half a ton, shaped like enormous millstones, and designed to roll across the narrow tunnel entrances from the inside, sealing off entire sections of the city in the event of an attack. These doors couldn't be moved from the outside at all, only from within, which tells you almost everything you need to know about the mindset of the people who built and used this place. This wasn't simply a convenient basement. It was a fortress, engineered specifically around the assumption that someday hostile forces would come looking for the people hiding inside it, and that when they did, those people needed to be able to seal themselves in completely and wait the danger out, safely, for as long as necessary. The ventilation system alone is enough to make modern engineers pause. More than 50 vertical shafts run from the surface all the way down to the lowest inhabited levels, some plunging as deep as 230 feet, engineered specifically to keep breathable air circulating through every occupied chamber of the city, even at its most crowded and its deepest point. These shafts also served a second, quietly brilliant purpose, functioning as the city's water supply, with wells built directly into several of the shafts that could be accessed from multiple levels without ever requiring anyone to go above ground. Whoever engineered this understood something that took the rest of the world centuries longer to formalize into modern architectural principle, that a shelter this deep and this crowded is completely useless if the people inside it suffocate or die of thirst before whatever they're hiding from ever goes away. Historians generally attribute the earliest phases of construction to the Phrygians, an ancient civilization active in the region as far back as the 8th century BC, though the soft volcanic rock throughout Cappadocia had almost certainly been carved and modified for shelter long before any of that. And the honest answer is that nobody can say with total certainty exactly how old the very first tunnels actually are. What we do know is that the city was massively expanded and reinforced over the following centuries, particularly by early Christian communities living under the Byzantine Empire, who used Derinkuyu and the wider underground network as protection during periods of persecution, and later, critically, as shelter during a long, brutal stretch of Arab-Byzantine raids that swept repeatedly through the region between the 7th and 10th centuries. For communities living through that period, an underground city wasn't an eccentric architectural choice. It was survival infrastructure, built and rebuilt over generations, specifically engineered to let an entire town simply disappear underground, seal the doors behind them, and effectively vanish from a raiding army's reach for weeks at a time if that's what it took. Here's where the story gets even stranger, though, because Derinkuyu is not standing alone underneath Cappadocia. A second, similarly massive underground city called Kamakla sits roughly 6 miles away, discovered and open to researchers around the same general period, with its own distinct network of levels, stables, storage rooms, and defensive doors, structured slightly differently from Derinkuyu, but clearly built with the same underlying philosophy of concealment and self-sufficiency. And it doesn't stop at 2. Researchers have identified at least another 200 smaller underground settlements and shelter complexes scattered throughout the wider Cappadocia region, ranging from modest, single-family refuge tunnels to sprawling multi-level complexes that rival Derinkuyu's and Kamakli in scale, many of them still only partially explored or mapped. And then there's the detail that tends to be the one that actually keeps people up at night once they hear it. A long, narrow connecting tunnel has been identified running between Derinkuyu and Kamaklu, roughly 5.5 miles of underground passage linking the two cities directly beneath the surface. It has never been fully excavated or opened, largely due to structural safety concerns and the sheer scale of the undertaking required to properly stabilize and clear a passage that long, that old, and that deep. Which means that right now, today, there is a confirmed underground corridor connecting 2 entire cities that nobody currently alive has walked the full length of. Only a fraction of Derinkuyu itself, somewhere around 8 of its 18 known levels, has ever actually been open to the public. The rest remains closed, some sections for structural safety reasons, since roof collapses and unstable ceiling sections are a genuine, ongoing engineering concern in a city carved almost 1,000 years ago out of volcanic stone, and some sections simply because full excavation hasn't been completed yet. Local authorities and archaeological teams have been explicit that additional undiscovered chambers likely still exist beneath what's already been mapped, and periodic construction projects in the surrounding villages continue to accidentally break through into previously unknown sections of tunnel, the exact same way the entire city was first discovered back in 1963. As recently as the past decade, further excavation work beneath a nearby castle in the town of Nevşehir uncovered what researchers believe may be an entirely separate underground city, potentially even larger than Derinkuyu itself, with early surveys estimating tunnel networks extending across an area of roughly 5 million square feet. That site is still, as of now, only in the early stages of excavation, and large sections of it remain completely sealed off, inaccessible even to the researchers actively studying it, simply because the process of safely clearing centuries of collapsed debris and confirming structural stability takes an enormous, slow, deliberate amount of time. And Cappadocia, as extraordinary as it is, turns out to be far from the only place on Earth where an entire hidden city has been sitting quietly beneath ordinary daily life, waiting to be stumbled into. Travel to northern France, and you'll find the underground city of Naurs, carved into soft limestone beneath a small village, originally excavated as far back as the 3rd century for stone quarrying, before local communities began expanding and repurposing the tunnels as a hiding place during centuries of war and invasion. By the 17th century, the underground complex at Naurs had grown enormous, featuring over 300 separate rooms, complete with stables, bakeries, chapels, and wells, capable of sheltering as many as 3,000 people at once during periods of conflict. And then, remarkably, the entire site was completely forgotten, buried under collapsed entrances and lost from public memory for roughly 2 centuries, until a local priest rediscovered it in 1887, stumbling onto an entire lost underground town that generations of people living directly above it had simply had no idea was there. Head to the island of Malta, and the underground mystery takes on an even older, stranger character. The hypogeum of Hal Saflieni is a subterranean complex carved roughly 5,000 years ago, predating both Stonehenge and the pyramids of Giza, cut across 3 distinct levels into solid rock, using nothing but simple stone and antler tools, as far as archaeologists have been able to determine. It was rediscovered completely by accident in 1902, when workers cutting cisterns for a new housing development broke through into the roof of a chamber that had lain sealed and undisturbed for millennia. Inside, archaeologists found evidence of what appears to have been both a burial site, containing the remains of thousands of individuals, and some kind of ceremonial or ritual space, including a small chamber known today as the Oracle Room, where a specific, unexplained quirk of the chamber's carved geometry causes any low, deep sound made inside it to resonate and amplify throughout the entire complex, an acoustic effect researchers still don't fully understand the original builder's level of intentionality behind. The hypogeum is, today, one of the most tightly restricted ancient sites on Earth. with visitor numbers capped at a strict daily limit specifically to protect its fragile, irreplaceable prehistoric carvings from humidity and carbon dioxide damage caused by simple human breathing, which means that right now, the vast majority of people who will ever hear about this place will never actually be permitted to set foot inside it. Even cities we think we know well have entire forgotten underground versions of themselves buried directly beneath their modern streets. Underneath Edinburgh, Scotland, sits a sealed network of underground vaults and a completely hidden street called Mary King's Close, a real, once thriving residential lane that was progressively built over and buried beneath newer construction throughout the 18th century, trapping the lower levels of the original buildings, along with, according to persistent local accounts, some of the residents who reportedly refused or were unable to evacuate before the ceiling was complete. The close remained essentially closed off and largely forgotten for roughly 250 years before being properly rediscovered, excavated, and eventually opened to the public as a historic site, revealing an entire frozen slice of 17th century urban life that had simply been sealed shut and left in the dark for 2.5 centuries. Beneath Beijing, meanwhile, sits a different, more recent kind of underground city, but one that fits the theme of forbidden, hidden infrastructure just as directly. Known as Dixiacheng, this sprawling underground complex was constructed starting in 1969 during a period of serious military tension, specifically engineered as a massive civil defense shelter capable of housing hundreds of thousands of residents in the event of a large-scale attack. The tunnel network reportedly stretches for dozens of miles beneath the city, connecting schools, factories, and government buildings, complete with its own ventilation systems, food storage depots, and, even according to some reports, an underground roller skating rink and cinema built to keep morale up during long stretches of potential shelter time. For decades, the full extent of this underground network remained officially classified, with only limited, carefully controlled sections ever open to tourists before being closed again, and large portions of the system reportedly remain off-limits, restricted, or simply unmapped in any publicly available record to this day. What's genuinely striking, once you start lining all of these up side by side, isn't just that each one exists individually. It's how consistently the same underlying instinct shows up across wildly different civilizations, separated by thousands of years and thousands of miles, with no plausible way any of them could have coordinated with or learned from one another. Faced with the threat of invasion, persecution, or catastrophe, over and over again throughout human history, the answer people converged on, independently, again and again, was the same one. Go down. Disappear into the earth itself, where an enemy on the surface literally cannot see you, cannot easily find you, and cannot follow you without an enormous, dangerous effort. Build the doors so they only open from the inside. Build the air shafts deep enough that nobody can starve you of breath. And then wait, sometimes for years, sometimes for generations, until it's finally safe to come back up into the light. And that, in a strange way, is exactly what makes discoveries like Derinkuyu so quietly haunting, more than 1,000 years after its last defensive door was ever sealed shut. These weren't ancient legends or exaggerated folklore passed down and inflated over centuries of retelling. They were real functioning engineered cities, built by ordinary people facing an extraordinary sustained threat, cities that worked exactly as intended for generation after generation, and then, at some point nobody fully recorded, were simply abandoned, sealed, and left to be quietly reclaimed by the earth above them. Entire communities lived, worked, prayed, and raised children in total darkness, hundreds of feet underground, and when they finally didn't need it anymore, they walked back up into the sunlight and eventually forgot it was even there. Villages were built directly on top of these cities for centuries, without anyone realizing what they were standing on. Families lived their entire lives never suspecting that beneath their kitchen floor, beneath their basement wall, sat rooms, streets, and stone doors built by people who had once been desperate enough and resourceful enough to build an entire hidden world simply to survive. And the unsettling part is that we almost certainly haven't found all of them. Cappadocia alone continues to reveal new tunnel sections almost every time a farmer digs a new well or a construction crew breaks ground on a new foundation. Ground-penetrating radar surveys across the wider region have identified what researchers believe are additional void spaces and chamber networks that haven't been excavated at all, sitting silently beneath farmland. Roads and modern villages, exactly the way Derinkuyu itself sat silently beneath an ordinary house until 1963, waiting for one man, one wall, and one accidental swing of a hammer to finally let the light back in. So the next time you're standing on solid ground, anywhere in the world, it might be worth remembering that solid ground is sometimes a lot less solid than it looks, and that somewhere beneath your feet, right now, there could be an entire forgotten city, sealed, silent, and waiting, with absolutely no idea that the world above it has moved on entirely without it.